Well, fancy seeing you here. Welcome back to Through the Decades, the podcast. Now, this week, I'm joined by my guest, John. However, before the episode begins, I want to let you know that you may find John speaks quite quietly, on occasions quite quickly, so you may find parts difficult to understand. So please do bear with him throughout the episode, but I promise it is most definitely worth it, as he has some truly incredible tales to share that are well worth the listen. So, without any further ado, let's get started with this week's episode and cue the intro. Hey, I'm Brad and welcome back to Through the Decades, the podcast. This series, I'm in Gabriel Court in Saffron Walden, Essex, which is another McCarthy Stone retirement living development. Just like last time, throughout the series, I'll be interviewing some of the homeowners and getting an insight into their entire lives from their childhood through the decades to the present day. And this week, I'm joined by John, who is 90 years young. So John, should we get started with this week's episode by you telling us a bit about yourself, who you are, and a bit about your life?
Yes, off we go. I was born in London, and I spent my time in London as a child, and then throughout the war, I lived in London, the Second World War, and I had a mother, a sister, and my father at the beginning of the war disappeared to serve in the army, and we saw him again 5 years later, but we continued to live in London. The bombs came down, and we continued to go into our air raid shelter, but we lived in London at the end of the war. I went to the local primary school, and I took the 11 plus exam, which I did in those days, and passed well enough to go to a public school. And the public school, I could get to on my bicycle, and it took me 45 minutes each way to cycle to my new big public school. There, we fortunately had cellars, because when the bombs came and the air raid warning went, we could hop into the cellars. And very wisely we did, because one day bombs dropped on a swimming pool, and the foreign language was part of the establishment and destroyed them, but we were in the cellars, so we were all right. I went and got my school certificate and my hires, and I decided, as everybody had to go into the Army or Navy or Air Force, what was called National Service, I'd go for the Army. I liked it, and I stayed a soldier for the rest of my life. Working life, that is. So I went to a place called Sandhurst, and banged my feet on the ground and saluted smartly and passed out into the regiment of my choice. My family came from Ireland, and so I chose an Irish regiment called the Inniskilling Fusiliers, and the Inniskillings came from the town with the same name in the northwest of Ireland. And so there I was. I passed out of Sandhurst, joined my regiment in Dover Castle, of all places, for an Irishman. But we were only there for 6 months when we flew out to Kenya, because there was an emergency rebels called the Mau Mau. And anyway, we spent 2 years, I was in 2 years of the regiment in Kenya, and patrolled the slopes of Mount Kenya, Aberdare Mountains, and put down, that's a bad word, dealt with riots in a place called Mombasa on the coast, Nairobi the capital. And 2 years I flew back with the rest of my regiment, and I was posted to Eton Hall Officer Cadet School as an instructor. And at the end of my time there, I had to rejoin my regiment in Berlin. And on the way from England to Berlin, I got married and took my new wife to Berlin. An interesting place in those days, because it was in East Germany, an island, Allied island, and with the Russians, the Americans, the French, and ourselves in Berlin, and each had a quarter of the city to look after. And we used to meet the Russians on duty from occasions, and socially too in those days, they would come to drinks parties and dinner parties, and it was entirely not relaxed, but friendly. Then went back to Kenya for a year, and I was then promoted to captain and told to go back to the depot in Northern Ireland, be the adjutant at the depot in Northern Ireland in a place called Omagh. So off I went back with my new wife to Omagh, a rather backward place in a way in those days, and we spent 2 years in there at Omagh, and we had a son. And then after 2 years in Omagh, I was selected for Staff College at Camberley in England, and I did 2 years at Staff College. And then I was due to go to a staff job, but I was told I was needed back with my battalion. And lo and behold, to my wife's delight, the battalion was in Berlin again. So we went back to Berlin, and she knew everywhere about Berlin. And the only difference was there was a wall being built right through the middle of the city, of the Berlin Wall. And my wife used to go all over the place. What I'm thinking now, I had to think about taking out a special day, Allied Forces ticket to cross the border between East and West Berlin. Anyway, we spent happy years with our little son and our new puppy dog. Oh, we came back to England, of course, to a place, Wiltshire. And while in Wiltshire, I was told I was going to go to Arabic language school because I was going to Oman. But I couldn't take my family, so we bought a house in Kent, because my wife liked Kent County Cricket Club, supported them, so we bought a house in Kent where she could live with my son, while I went off and chased Arabs around Arabia. There was a war going on for the Dhofar War during my time there, and I got in and around and spoke my Arabic. I couldn't read or write it, and so at the Sultan would only allow 12 European visitors in a country 5 times the size of England at any one time. However, I managed to fill the account, and my wife and son came out and spent 3 weeks with me over a Christmas period, so that was fun for them. And after that, what happened to me after that? Oh, I went back to England to rejoin my regiment, and lo and behold, I was told I was going to be a lieutenant colonel and go and command a battalion in Northern Ireland. So my wife, who loved Northern Ireland like her, I won't say that, we all took off to Northern Ireland, and my son then went to my old school as a boarder. He was roughly the prep school part. We went back to Northern Ireland, and after 2 years there, I went to York in England, as you probably know, to look after postings for officers for a certain part of Ireland and England and Scotland, to different places. And then I was told to go and learn German. I learned German for a year and became the instructor in Hamburg at the German Staff College. My wife also learned German for a year, so we went and lived in Hamburg. And my wife delighted in Hamburg because it was a fine city and had a branch of a shop called Fortnum & Mason's from London in the centre of the city, where she could happily spend money in a civilised way. So we stayed in Hamburg, and then I went to the Ministry of Defence. We're going to the end of my time in the army now, and I was put in charge of the army part of the Armed Forces Pay Review Body, and I had to go around the world seeing what soldiers did, and then putting down a bit of paper, and then going to a pay review body and putting my evidence for the pay grade of soldiers in the army in front of these people. I then was asked to go stay in London as running recruiting for the army in London. I agreed to that, which meant an extension to my time as a soldier. It also gave me a free personal car to drive about in, which was useful. And then I entered my career in the army in London at the Ministry of Defence.
Wow, some really incredible stories there, John. They really are. Thank you for that. But you mentioned earlier that you grew up in London during the war. So how was life growing up as a child, really young, in such a daunting and worrying environment?
We had a shelter, first of all, a thing called Anderson shelter in a garden, which was desperately cold, wet, and nasty, and we really went down. But then they provided a shelter called a Morrison shelter, which was a steel sort of table which could be put up inside the house. And you slept on a big mattress with a dog, everybody, in under this steel wall. We didn't like this very much, so at night you didn't want to sleep there regularly, so only when the sirens went, would we come downstairs and continue under the shelter. And one unfortunate night, my dear grandmother fell down the stairs and was killed on the spot. And then we stayed there, and as you said, I went to school in London. And at school I told her about the fact we had to go in the cellars if the area warden went. During my time in London, my father came back for 6 months in England after Dunkirk, and I remember clearly meeting my papa, and he said, "John, I've got your birthday present," and all he had was a pack he bought back on his back, and there was a model engine he bought for my birthday. So I thought it was very kind of Daddy to think of that before anything else. And then Daddy was in the UK about 6 months, 9 months, and off he went to Africa, and he spent his war away from us. What else would you want me to say? At school, I played rugby and tennis, and I joined a school corps, cadet force. And in those days, that was very good. It was well supported financially, so you got good lunches and meals, if any were. And as I said, I went up to those days. You had to get a selection board for a week, as you do today, to be selected for Sandhurst. And in my day, you spent 6 months in the ranks before you went to Sandhurst. And I spent that 6 months in Northern Ireland with my regiment as a soldier before going to Sandhurst and then becoming an officer in the regiment. And as I said,
You've had a really busy life, lots going on, but looking back when you were first entering the world of work, growing away from your childhood, becoming an adult, what was your first job?
well, I had a year between leaving school and going into the army, and I became an assistant inspector of taxes, grade 3, at a tax office in Holborn in London.
Wow.
And I went up there every day, and I was put in charge of another young man who was also going to the army, of a reception room. In those days, you didn't have mobile phones. There was a big telephone exchange for this block. We worked the telephone exchange.
Right.
And it was a marvellous fun, because you could, when the thing dropped down and said, our manager, you could listen, had a girlfriend. He was married, but had a girlfriend in London. And on Fridays, he'd always come through and say, I'm off for a meeting this afternoon in head office and such. And we all knew he's going to have the afternoon with his girlfriend. And we said, yes, Mr. So-and-so, whatever his name was, have a nice time. See you on Monday. But he was trotting off with his girlfriend this afternoon. So that was a nice job from that point of view. And in those days, again, unlike you sitting there not having taken note, everybody had a vast file, income tax file, do you follow? And these were all filed in the office at the back where there was a filing system for the office. And so when somebody came in, you would say, I'm Mr. Bloggs, I've come to see the Inspector of Taxes. I'd go and look and find his file, go and get the Inspector of Taxes, put Mr. Bloggs and the taxes, and they go off and do some work. Fortunately, there was a striptease club nearby called, I forget what it's called, and the dear ladies who worked there actually had their accounts with us. And you could look and see, it's Miss So-and-so, who was at the striptease club and so on. And you would say, oh, nice to meet you. And that was, in a way, it was different, but you did meet people, different employments. And so from that point of view, the job was interesting and prepared you for meeting people in later life. It wasn't as if you sat in an office all by yourself and pushed paper. You did sit in this outer office, listening on the telephone, and meet people. In particular, the deputy, a very nice man of his office, aimed to get a job of a tax inspector for the Channel Islands, which was a lovely job out there, being paid beyond holiday permanently, as he said. And the day this guy was told he'd got the job, we had a splendid party. And so that's the sort of thing I remember taking over, yeah.
It sounds like you've experienced so much throughout your life, John, and obviously with that comes a lot of lessons that you learn through everything that you've done. What would you say has been the biggest lesson that you have learned throughout your life?
Throughout my life, always look at the bright side. There's always a bright side. If somebody's dead, you will say, well, he had a good life and he died peacefully. And you say, well, that's a plus.
Yeah.
And you look at the future and say, well, I haven't been selected for going further, but the job I've got instead of being promoted will be great fun.
If you could go back to any age or any year in your life, John, what would it be and why?
Well, it was in Hamburg. I had this interesting job at the German Staff College. I had to speak German to everybody. You follow me, my wife too. And our son was at school back in the UK, and we were there. And lo and behold, we heard he came out for holidays, and the great day for all of us was he'd been accepted to go to St John's College, Cambridge, and so we went on to town and had a good time. And that for me was, yes, we'd had a son, he'd gone to school, a happy marriage. He'd worked hard and got this place at John's, which is a rare, it's not exactly easy to achieve. And yes, that was a great occasion for us.
If you could choose one day of your life and call it the best day of your life, what would it be? I mean, this is a very big question because there must be so many days or moments in your life that you could consider the best day of your life. But if you had to choose just one day, what would you say was the best day of your life, John?
Oh, when I got a letter, I was in Keene, sitting there on the backside, there were in the mountains, I opened a letter from my wife to me saying, okay, John, let's get married when we get back. And so I was opening that letter in the mountains, nowhere.
Wow.
Well, civilized, but it came in the post. Second best, of course, when my son was born. And yeah, so that's 2 good days, yeah.
Yeah. So John, let's move to the present day. You're now living here at Gabriel Court in Saffron Walden. How long have you been living here and why did you decide to move to this development in particular?
We've been here for 8 years and we lived in Kent, my wife and I, when we left the army because, as I probably told you, my wife liked cricket and supported Kent. So we lived in Kent to watch cricket in Canterbury, Tunbridge was, other places. And then my wife was taken quite ill and living was getting a bit difficult. We had a big house and dogs and all that. And my son, who lives not far from here in a place called Hedham, said, Father, come north of the Thames because they only had the tunnels then and getting to and fro was difficult. and lived near us. So my daughter-in-law found this place and said, I think it'll do, and we came and looked. It was like so many others, nothing special really. We had looked one or two. And we said fine, and we came here, and it's not too big. There's only 28 apartments. It's near the town, Saffron Walden. You can walk there and back, and it's near Cambridge. It's quite an interesting place. I'm afraid Colchester reminds me of the army, so I'd never go there again. And that's about it.
And John, before we started this interview, you mentioned that you don't really interact with the social events that go on downstairs, and that's down to you and your personal preference, the way you like your independence. But you have been able to form friendships within the development that you wouldn't have had otherwise with people of similar interests to you, which is a bonus, and I'm sure you'll agree, which is something that you wouldn't have had without this development. But John, I'm going to wrap up this interview and this episode in the way that I wrap up every single one of my episodes and ask you, what one piece of advice would you give to the younger generations at home listening to this podcast?
Stick to your guns. If you're going for something, go for it. You will be, from time to time, you'll find difficulties, people you get on with, but have an aim and keep going for that aim. And in spite of all the problems, you'll finish up in the right place. Okay?
And there we have it, another episode done. Thank you, John, for joining me and sharing your tales with us. And make sure you are joining me next week with my final guest of this series, Desmond. He'll be here sharing his tales through the decades. And of course, don't forget to share the podcast on Spotify, Amazon Music or YouTube, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Apart from that, I'll see you same time next week for the finale of Season 2.